Hello and welcome to the webinar on the National Historic Preservation Act. My name is Sarah Marlett and I am an environmental protection specialist and historic preservation specialist with FEMA Region 3 in the Philadelphia office. While the National Historic Preservation Act wasn't the first preservation-focused act in the country, once passed, it became the primary historic preservation law, and it outlines federal responsibilities regarding preservation and stewardship of historic buildings. One thing that led to the NHPA was that prior to the act, it wasn't uncommon for historic properties to be damaged or destroyed by federal actions, like the construction of the interstate highway system or urban renewal projects. The NHPA was established to identify and preserve above and below ground historic sites across the United States and its territories, and to put in place a process for federal agencies to consider the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. The NHPA created a few different things to achieve the goal of ensuring that the effects of projects on historic properties are considered. The first is that each state, territory, and tribe has an individual or office tasked with the responsibility of overseeing that area's preservation programs. That includes preservation planning and the plan administration. These officers are called State Historic Preservation Officers or Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, and you'll hear them referred to as SHPOs and TIPOs. When projects are being reviewed under the NHPA, consultations are sent to the SHPOs and TIPOs. Second is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is an independent agency that was designed to advise the President and Congress regarding historic preservation matters. The ACHP oversees the Section 106 process, which is a part of the NHPA, and which I'll describe soon. And they draft regulations and ensure that federal agencies are following the act as they should. As needed, the ACHP can also consult with and provide guidance to federal agencies. Another important thing the NHPA did was found the National Register of Historic Places and the list of National Historic Landmarks. The National Register of Historic Places is a list of properties determined to be worthy of preservation at the local, state, or national level, and that are usually at least 50 years old. National Historic Landmarks are buildings that are determined to possess exceptional value in illustrating the heritage of the United States. If a building is determined to be an NHL, it is automatically listed on the National Register of Historic Places. There's only about 2,600 NHLs in the country. So what's the point of the NHPA? Overall, the point is to identify historic properties, consider how they may be affected by federal actions, evaluate the effects, and try to avoid adverse impacts. Before we can really dive into what the NHPA does, it's important to understand what defines a historic property. The NHPA tells us how to make this determination, and actually making that determination is part of the process that reviewers go through when completing each project review. Being historic doesn't mean that a resource is famous or well-known in any capacity. The project reviewer's job is to learn about each resource, see if it's already been determined to be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, which would mean that someone else has already previously done this step in the past. And if it's not already on the National Register, then the reviewer looks at a number of different qualities to come to a conclusion about if the building is historic. First thing that most people check is the age of the resource. And when I say resource, that includes buildings, structures, objects, sites, and districts. To further define that, a building is something made to shelter human activity. It usually has 4 walls and a roof. A structure may provide shelter, but it wasn't built to be a shelter. This could be like a bridge. An object is usually something that was simply constructed. It might be small in scale or artistic in nature. This could be a statue or a fountain in a public square. A site is a location of a significant event, occupation, or activity where the location itself has historic value, regardless of the value of any existing structure. And a district is a unified entity that is often composed of a wide variety of resources. This could be a neighborhood like Georgetown in DC, or it could be an archaeological district. The reviewer will determine the resource's age, and usually that resource needs to be 50 years old to be considered historic. For many projects, we consider buildings 45 years old to be old enough for review, since sometimes projects take a long time to get moving forward. There are also some resources that, even if they're nowhere close to 50 years old, they may possess exceptional value and could still be considered historic. Besides just being at least usually 50 years old, a historic property is also significant and has sufficient integrity to convey its significance. Significant means that the building played a part in history in some meaningful way. Historic preservation professionals use 4 different criteria to determine if a resource is significant. We look at if the building, 1, was associated with an event like a battlefield or the Ford Theater, 2, supported a person significant in the past, like a presidential home or an artist's studio, or 3, has distinctive design or construction, if a building shows the work of a master architect or has high artistic value, like Falling Water or the Empire State Building or the Golden Gate Bridge, or 4, if it has yielded or has the potential to yield important information to prehistory or history, like the Cahokia Mounds. And then, if a resource is determined to be significant, we'll see if it still has sufficient integrity to convey its significance. Integrity includes things like, is it still in the same location it was historically in? Are the materials the same as they were historically? Like if it was a wood building, is the wood still there, or has it been replaced with vinyl? Can you see the physical evidence of workmanship, which is the crafts of a particular culture or people from that period of history? And integrity can also be the feeling or association, meaning does the resource still evoke the sense of the past, or does it show the link between the property and the person or event for which it is significant? So you can see how there's a number of things that need to be considered when determining if a building is historic or not. That's one reason why the person who is doing the identification and evaluation of the properties needs to be qualified by what is called the Secretary of the Interior's Professional Qualification Standards. This ensures that the person doing the evaluation has a background in history or architecture and a certain amount of experience in doing this type of work. When agencies are reviewing projects under the NHPA, they are responsible for identifying buildings that are already listed on the NRHP and those that are eligible. So it's really important that someone who is SOI qualified reviews every project that might affect a resource. Section 106 is the portion of the NHPA that actually requires action during a project review. This is the section of the Act that says that federal agencies have to review projects that are either federally funded or federally permitted. In that review, the agency is tasked with considering the effects of the project that the project might have on historic properties and seeking a way to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any adverse effect on those properties. There is no required outcome of the Section 106 process. Ultimately, historic properties do not have to be preserved, and funding wouldn't be automatically taken from a project that affects historic resources. However, the process of Section 106 often allows for the consideration of alternatives and scope modifications that could avoid affecting resources and simultaneously move the project forward. This graphic describes the Section 106 process. FEMA is required to complete the entire Section 106 process for each project. For projects with significant effects to historic properties, the consultation process can take months. The Section 106 process involves 4 steps, each of which is intended to answer a question about the project. 1. Establish the undertaking. It answers the question, what are we doing? 2. Identify and evaluate the undertaking answers the question, are there historic properties in the area? Once you've figured out what's happening, then you figure out where exactly the project will affect. This is called the area of potential effects, written sometimes as APE. The APE isn't necessarily just the physical spot that the project touches, and it can also include visual effects within the project's viewshed. If a project occurs within a building, the APE is likely fairly small, maybe just the building itself. But if the project includes an activity such as demolition or clearing trees, the APE could be much larger, including the street or as far away as could reasonably be seen from that spot. Consider things like the topography, vegetative screening, and proximity to historic districts. 3. Assess adverse effects answers the question, will the project negatively impact historic properties? The criteria of adverse effect describes an adverse effect as when an undertaking may alter, directly or indirectly, any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify that property for inclusion in the NRHP in a manner that would diminish the integrity. Consider effects that may occur later in time or that could be cumulative. Step 4 is to resolve adverse effects, and that answers the question, how can we offset the impact to historic properties? If there is an adverse effect, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation can weigh in and give feedback. The agency can discuss options with the applicant that could avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effect, and the public, SHPO, and TIPO can give input as well. There are 3 types of determinations that FEMA could come to when reviewing a project under Section 106. The first is no historic properties affected. For this, you've established the APE and you've found that there are no resources above or below ground within the APE that are listed on or eligible for the NRHP. 2, no adverse effect. This means that there is a resource that is on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, but there will either be no effect or a minimal effect. The third is adverse effect to historic properties. In this case, there is a resource on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, and the project will impact the resource adversely. Each state, district, and tribe has a state tribal or historic preservation officer, that's SHPO or the TIPO. When projects occur that affect resources or an area over 50 years old, the lead agency consults with the SHPO or TIPO. FEMA will send a consultation letter that includes a description of the project, a description of the resource, and a discussion of the resource's history, context, significance, and integrity. The consultation letter will include FEMA's determination of National Register of Historic Places eligibility and effects on historic resources, such as no historic properties affected or no adverse effect. The SHPO or TIPO will consider FEMA's determination and will respond, either concurring with FEMA's finding or they will describe why they do not agree. Continued consultation may be required pending the results of the SHPO or TIPO's determination. SHPOs and TIPOs typically have 30 days to review a project when it's not related to a disaster. Federally recognized Native American tribes are sovereign nations, and the federal government interacts with the tribes on a government-to-government basis. When there are projects on tribal land or on lands that tribes have a historical interest in, FEMA will participate in consultation with the TIPO. Different project types have different potential levels of impact. FEMA-funded actions with the greatest potential to impact historic properties include demolition and other ground disturbance. Demolition could have a significant impact if the resource was historic age and was not previously evaluated for the National Register of Historic Places. If the resource was listed on or eligible for the NRHP, demolition would be an adverse effect. Ground disturbance could affect historic properties when it occurs in previously undisturbed ground. Ground that has not been previously disturbed may have information potential and yield archaeological resources. Disturbing the resources would be an adverse effect. Other activities can also have effects, like renovation and elevation, particularly if the resources are within historic districts. Activities like elevating houses and replacing cladding and windows can remove integrity and can visually affect historic districts and resources. FEMA has agreements with all of the states, Washington, D.C., and some tribes in Region 3 that allows the review process to be streamlined. The programmatic agreement allows some activities to proceed without SHPO or TIPO consultation and allow for an expedited review of disaster-related projects. Some activities often excluded from regular consultation due to the programmatic agreements include debris removal and disposal, in-kind interior building repairs, in-kind repairs to roads and embankments, and the replacement of building contents. These are a few additional resources available. Thank you for your time. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have further questions.